I absolutely love Christmas music, so I had to start the show with some Christmas music, and hopefully you're enjoying some of the tracks that we pick for each of these episodes. Today we're going to be chatting about a topic that I think many of you, if not most, will find extremely interesting, and that has to do with some of the SolarWinds and the Kaseya breaches that happened over the last number of months here in 2021. What's interesting, though, is we're not going to go deep into those breaches, but rather we're going to hear directly from the researchers at Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 group that did their cloud threat report on cloud native supply chain risks. And this is something that I don't think is talked about enough, which is why I think you're going to find it quite interesting. But first, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Prisma Cloud secures infrastructure, applications, data, and entitlements across the world's largest clouds, all from a single unified solution. With a combination of cloud service provider APIs and a unified agent framework, users gain unmatched visibility and protection. Prisma Cloud also integrates with any continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow to secure cloud infrastructure and applications early in development. You can scan infrastructure as code templates, container images, serverless functions, and more while gaining powerful full-stack runtime protection. This is unified security for DevOps and security teams. To find out more, go to prismacloud.io. Today we feature the Unit 42 latest cloud threat report for the second half of 2021. And today we have Nathaniel Q. Quist and Dr. Jay Chen from the Unit 42 cloud threat team joining us. Jay and Q, thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
So in this report, you guys focused on supply chain security in the cloud, right? So there's obviously this is an area that has been talked about a lot with SolarWinds, Kaseya. So I guess my question for you is why did you focus on cloud supply chain security in this edition of the Cloud Threat Report? What was the reason behind that? So maybe Jay, I'll start with you, and Q, I'd love to hear you chat about that as well. What drove you guys down this path?
Sure. So supply chain attack is nothing new, right? We have heard it 10 years ago, at least. However, supply chain attack has been a buzzword in the last 10 months, most likely due to the very high impact attack such as SolarWinds, Kaseya. So as a cloud security researcher, the natural question I have is that how supply chain attack can happen in cloud environment. And if it actually happens, what will be the target and what will be the weak links in cloud environment and that attacker most likely to target? And so we also try to answer what are the strategies and actions that we can take to protect or prevent this type of attacks from happening in cloud environment.
Q, how about your perspective?
Yeah, very well said for Jay. I can echo pretty much everything that he just said. It's supply chain attacks have been common and frequent for a very long time. Unit 42 has had reports that we've been tracking since 2015. Some of those notable ones, back like CC Cleaner just a couple of years ago. Kaseya and most notably SolarWinds just kind of build on top of that and kind of show in an ever increasingly complex world how supply chain can really affect not just one organization, but that trickle down effect that it can affect thousands of organizations just by one SaaS provider being compromised.
So tell us, what did you find most intriguing about these findings? I want to hear, I know each one of you kind of have a different specialty within cloud security and just threat research in general. So I want to hear what really stood out to you in the findings. Jay, why don't you go first? And then I want to hear from you on this as well.
Sure. So the part of the research I did focus on analyzing a large number of Terraform template and Kubernetes Helm chart template and container image, trying to understand and how the vulnerabilities and misconfiguration in this commonly used cloud native code may be introduced. So here are some numbers in my findings. 60% of the Terraform templates, public Terraform templates that I analyzed contain at least one misconfiguration. And for the Kubernetes Helm chart that I analyzed, 99%, which is like unbelievable high number, 99% of this Kubernetes Helm chart contain at least one misconfiguration. And for the container image that I saw in those Kubernetes Helm charts, 96% of them contain at least one known vulnerability. So these are nothing, these numbers are not something really new. Like this type of research has been done many, many times before. But in this report, we try to link them together, try to look them together. When cloud native application is deployed, it first deploy an infrastructure with this number of misconfiguration, and it deploy a Kubernetes infrastructure with another set of vulnerability, and eventually come with the container application, which again come with some sort of vulnerabilities. And this is the first time that we look at all these misconfiguration and vulnerabilities together.
Q, how do you see this?
Yeah, cloud is ever complex, right? And anytime that we bring complexity into question, there's going to be some failings, either human failings or just a sheer oversight that someone didn't pay attention to something, that's going to be magnified or amplified within code. Infrastructure is code templates, however that is being created, and that's carried over even into this environment. If we look at the red team event that we did, that the exercise, we found that the failings still persist. There was simple failings. This is a mature environment that we looked at, and we still found that it was relatively easy to compromise them, not by any crazy vulnerability or because we're expert zero-day code writers or anything like that. We found hard-coded credentials in code repositories. There's a lot of ways that we can, simple mistakes that just due to the complexity, I believe, of that environment, just allowed it to be overlooked. So there's a lot of work that we as an industry can do to really push for automation scanning, push for that shifting left of security to make computers actually do what computers are supposed to do, especially within cloud with that dynamically scaling environment that moves faster than a human can push a button. Be able to have that system, a security system, actually scanning those environments as fast as they're being deployed, really can make these environments a whole lot more secure.
So if, just to give our audience, maybe they haven't read the report yet, you're talking about, I read this I'll look up the page number here in a couple minutes, but I know that you guys actually did, this is what you're referencing, a hands-on red team exercise at the request of a customer. So I guess let's kind of double click on the red team exercise, Q. And I want to hear from you basically, what was the context of it? What did they ask you to attack? What were maybe some of the confines? And then tell me just about maybe what you found in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, awesome. So what the red team exercise was supposed to be was we were going to assume the role of an internal developer. So we're just a generic a role that a contractor might have with an environment to build, XYZ widget or something within that environment. So what we were given access to a very standard, user-based access control that says you're a developer, you can get into this environment, you can, modify code within your environment. So we were going to take that, and as masquerading insiders, we were going to see if we can find a way to go from that developer role and move into, administrator role and actually own the entire cloud environment. So that was the kind of scope of our agenda.
So this was, I want to interrupt you real quick. So this was a real environment, right? This wasn't like a sandbox. This was a real development environment. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. This was an actual developer's environment. So within a CI/CD pipeline, not to go too far down the hole, CI stands for continuous integration. And that is primarily what we were targeting. And that is like the initial phase of a supply chain. It's how you integrate systems, it's how you build those processes or those components within that particular supply chain. And then they have that trickle out effect into the rest of the supply chain, right? Or they actually go into production after that. And so SolarWinds, we really used that attack framework that APT29 did in order to attack SolarWinds, the Orion product. We wanted to model our attack very similar to how they perform that attack. So we didn't want to attack directly the source code itself. We wanted to go to kind of a side chain supporting infrastructure for that supply chain. So we really used the SolarWinds attack as a framework and a methodology to initialize and conceptualize how we were going to perform the red team exercise itself.
So it sounds like there were some similarities. Again, I know you guys have a lot of detail on this in the report, so we won't go into all the details here on the podcast. And by the way, if the audience wants to download the threat report, all they need to do is go to cloudthreat.report. Just put that in your browser, cloudthreat.report, and it'll take you right to a place where you can download the report. But I guess one of the questions that I had when I read the report was, you guys didn't attempt to replicate the whole thing that happened with SolarWinds, right? That was outside in. It looks like, is it fair to categorize this as an inside out type of scenario that you played out?
Yeah, the actual attack itself is inside up. We did get privilege escalation. We were able to grab administrator rights to that cloud environment. So we did lateral movement and then privilege escalated up to own the environment. So in essence, we would own the supply chain systems, applications themselves. We could just log right into them and then modify any code that we wanted to. Yeah, at APT29, they actually did a phishing attack. That's how they officially gained access to SolarWinds itself, and they went through that. So we just kind of, skipped the initial access portion, and we jumped straight into actually have, say, we've already owned a box inside the system, and now we're laterally moving to own the rest of the environment.
Okay, that makes sense. And it's really, really intriguing. So one last point I want to key in on, and then Jay, I'll jump to you. But Q, you mentioned that this client had what most would consider good or mature cloud security. Why did you say that? And what were they missing?
Certainly. I mean, they had all the tools there. They did have role-based access control. They actually did have user granularity. They had, the AWS environment that they were using. They actually had, specific IAM controls for specific services, for specific users. They had their environment very well locked down. And they also had, security tools like, say, AWS's or, Amazon's guard duty, deployed and configured, at least for some of their accounts. And then they also had, obviously, Prisma Cloud in there as well, which was, aggregating and collecting a lot of the log data and, looking for misconfigurations and things of that nature. And those were all very critical because during the red team exercise, a portion of our exercise was actually detected by the organization, the security team. And that's good. That's what we want to have. However, in the same token, not all of it was, configured 100% correctly. And we were able to kind of squeak through the side. Even though one aspect was caught, we were still able to maintain access in the environment. So they had tools, they had security tools that were great. They were able to, perform security actions to mitigate their risk that they had their particular cloud environment. So we wanted to highlight that. Said we were caught. This is how we got caught, but we need to go. There are we've gone through steps 1, 2, and 3. Now we need to go for 5, 6, 7. And go to the next little step.
That's great. Well, I appreciate that. So for the audience, if you want to jump right to the red team exercise in the report, download the report, cloudthreat.report, and go right to page 5. That's where we cover the red team exercise in depth. So that was one part of the report. The other part really went very deep into infrastructure as code and just how that is a key to supply chain protection for organizations that are building cloud native infrastructure. So Jay, I know that you spent a lot of time really kind of doing a teardown on a lot of the popular components, open source components, Terraform modules, Kubernetes Helm charts, container images. Looking at some of the data that you presented when analyzing popular open source repos, the report shows that when it came to Terraform modules, you found that 64% of those downloaded resulted in at least one high or critical insecure misconfiguration. Tell us, what does that mean? And what's the impact for those building cloud native applications?
we analyzed more than, I think, 1,500 different Terraform open source Terraform modules. And I want to say that not all Terraform, not all modules or not all open source codes out there are equal. Some modules are used more often, are more popular than others. So when we see that, hey, this one module has a critical vulnerability, however, if this module is only used by a handful of users, that may not be a big deal. However, if we see another module that has one moderate misconfiguration, but it has been downloaded millions of times by maybe thousands or more different organizations and users, it's a very concerning misconfiguration right there. So one thing we look at is the number of downloads from each modules that we analyze. So this number, the number of downloads sort of indicate how popular and the number of the users and organizations may be impacted by the misconfigurations in this module.
So the way I read this was that some of the most popular modules, which mean the reason that they're most popular is because they're highly used, right, in cloud native infrastructure. 64%, the vast majority, mean that anybody who's using those are starting from an insecure state. Is that a correct assumption from that? Is that right?
Right. So those modules are created for usability, not really for security. They want anybody who download and import those modules can start immediately. However, the user still need to lock down those infrastructure depending on their use case and use and their environment. So those modules are not really written in a secure by default mindset.
That makes sense. So I noticed on page 13, this is another thing. Again, there's so much really good data in this report. I'd love to go over all of it, but we'd be here probably for 3 or 4 hours. But let's jump to page 13 of the report. You have a chart that talks about the relationship between the number of misconfigurations and dependencies. Walk us through what you found and just help us to try to understand at a most high level as possible what the impact is of that relationship between misconfigurations and dependencies.
I think a quick summary is that we found a positive correlation between the number of misconfiguration and the number of dependencies, meaning that for an application, the more dependent code or dependent package you have, then the more misconfiguration in your application. That is what we found in both Kubernetes Helm chart as well as container images. So let me explain a little bit how the modern Kubernetes applications is deployed in the cloud environment. Usually people use a Kubernetes template. Helm chart is a tool that allow automation, deployment, and management of Kubernetes application. So most of people just download a Helm chart and deploy this Helm chart for their application. However, when packaging your application as a Helm chart, each Helm chart can also depend on other Helm charts. So what we found is that most of the Kubernetes Helm chart that we see in public space now has at least one dependent Helm chart. And some Helm charts actually depend on more than 10 or even 20 different Helm charts. And when we analyze the application and consider all the dependent Helm chart it pulled in, we found that, hey, there's a clear positive correlation between the number of misconfiguration that will be deployed in your environment and the number of dependent Helm chart that you pull.
So one of the things I know you focused on was also containers, right? So talk about Kubernetes Helm charts. Obviously, Kubernetes and containers are very well and very strongly interlinked. And Kubernetes are pretty much used in every cloud native environment. Was the news any better with what you found with respect to containers and dependencies?
Just we saw identical pattern and I would say problem, right? So in analyzing the Kubernetes Helm chart, we focus on configurations, but when analyzing the container image, we focus on the vulnerabilities. And concept is pretty much the same when building a container image. Most developers also rely on many third-party libraries that is needed for the application or needed for the platform or operating system. So when peeling off each layer or digging down to the platform and operating system under the application, we realize that most of the modern cloud-native applications depend on many third-party libraries or package. And again, we found a positive correlation between the number of vulnerabilities in a container image with the number of dependent package that this container image use. The more dependent package in a container image usually indicate the more vulnerabilities.
I know that when I read the report, I was somewhat shocked, right? Just because I knew that the cloud itself has long suffered from misconfigurations, right? We see the same thing, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, SaaS, they're like all plagued by the same thing. But the detail that I think you guys were able to tease out in this report and how it specifically fits to, what so many organizations are doing right now, right? So I think, elsewhere, somewhere in the report, I think it may say this, that, kind of the first wave of migrations to the cloud were really lift and shift, right? And it was pretty much just taking existing applications, right. Moving them to the cloud. But now the second wave that's been, going on now for probably 3+, almost 4 years is really about organizations going cloud native, where they are using all of these different components that you guys talk about in the report, right? CI/CD pipelines, they're automating the builds with infrastructure as code, they're using containers. I guess what this leaves me thinking is, and probably most of our listeners as they're hearing this, A, they're thinking, okay, how does this impact my environment? And then B, what can I do about it? Or how do I prevent and mitigate some of these things? Q, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Maybe just, we don't have time to obviously do an exhaustive discussion on it, but what would be a good first step?
Oh, I like exhaustive conversations. Let's talk about this forever. So a good first step. I think you're right. I think most organizations, are doing really well in building, using infrastructure as code, building dynamically. For one, because that's where their money is, right? So that's where they want to build and maintain, keep that 99.9999% uptime as well as they possibly can. So obviously, getting that infrastructure as code operating, making sure that their, clusters, their Kubernetes clusters can scale dynamically and all that is very important. I think the next step is, again, how do we build security into the beginning of it? I think the really cool thing about infrastructure as code is that you can start putting security in the very beginning and it's already containerized, right? It's already modular in nature. So you can just dump a security tool at the very beginning of it and it's not going to break the rest of your build. It's going to just augment and enhance the rest of your build. So build your security scanning tools, put in your checkoffs if you're going to do open source, if you have bridge crew, build that right into the very beginning as your containers are building, as they're going up, as they're going through Jenkins or whatever CI tool that you're using, Circle CI or, JFrog, what have you, and really start building in, doing those checks. Are these containers misconfigured? Does this particular application have a vulnerability in it? Do I need to grab a newer version of this particular containerized application, et cetera? At the exact same time, using tools like Bridge Crew and Checkoff to actually say, do I have hard-coded credentials in this build somewhere? Trying to knock out some of those early pieces. And again, means we have this infrastructure as code functionality or this, architectural framework we can build security also into, even after it's already been created and off the runway. We can just add security as we're flying down the road or down through the sky or whatever. It makes it really nice. So, yeah, it's great that we can scale dynamically and move fast, but we need to get that security in there. And we really need to get developers, used to those tools, not have security teams being like, no, you can't do this, but say, hey, this is how we keep, you can move as fast as you possibly want to move. We want you to move as quickly as you want to move and build as fast as you want to build, but make sure that it's at least satisfying some of those basic security checks like hard-coded credentials, getting those things taken care of, knocked out from the very beginning.
I appreciate that response. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Jay, how do you see this? And I guess the other thing I'd throw into that is what would be a good first step? And then are there, I think Q, you mentioned Bridge Crews, Chekhov as a possible tool to use that can be enabled, given to developers. Jay, how do you see this? What are some tools maybe that you recommend as well?
So there are, of course, multiple steps, but I guess I only have one. I only have time for one step. My first step will be to gain visibility. And the deeper I work on this research, the more I realize how this virtualization help accelerate the technology. However, how much information is hidden from the user. The application we deploy and we probably use only less than 20% of the code for application, and a large number of the dependency and complexity are hidden from us. And speaking of visibility, we can talk in different layers. We need to, to protect your cloud environment, you need to gain visibility into your infrastructure, into your application, into your resource, into your IAM. So I think this is the most important first step to gain visibility to anything, because before you can start to create a rail, before you can start to manage these different objects or different resource, different components in your cloud environment. And in cloud environment, gaining visibility is actually much easier because everything is API based. You can call one API to see what are the virtual machine in your EC2 environment, for example. You don't need to worry about someone, like in the past, in the physical environment, someone can easily drop a smartphone or Raspberry Pi into your data center and you have no idea. But in cloud environment, API really make it much easier to gain visibility.
Well, thank you guys for giving us this quick, high-level overview of some of the findings in the threat report. So one last question for each of you. What are you working on next? I know that you're constantly and continuously doing big projects. Q, let's start with you. What are you working on? What are you most excited about right now in cloud security?
Yeah, I mean, just if I could go back, I love working with this team. It's awesome because, what Jay just said right there with gaining visibility in cloud is just so important, so critical. How can we gain that insight into what's running runtime in an environment? So very cool. I love it. The thing that I'm most excited about right now is that it still seems like we're still so new. So there's still so much stuff to look at within cloud infrastructure and cloud space. I love thinking about how things are being attacked and how things are being compromised. And I like to know who's doing it and how they're doing it and why they may be doing it. So that person behind the keyboard, behind the cloud is something that I'm very interested in. That being said, gaining visibility into some of those more integrated systems like service meshes, network meshes, things of that nature. That's the next piece that I'm looking at and I'm diving down, doing my research on. So look forward to something coming down that in the future.
That's awesome. That'll be exciting. I haven't seen a lot around service meshes, so I'll be curious to see what you come up with here over the next few months. Jay, what's next for you? What are you looking at?
I'm interested in looking into the multi-cloud type of infrastructure. More and more organizations are moving toward multi-cloud infrastructure because they need certain features of service from specific cloud service provider. For example, they prefer the AI, ML, or BigQuery service from Google, but they need to store their data in a Glacier or Snowflake type of environment, AWS, and they prefer to manage their identity using Active Directory under Azure. So this is a pattern that we commonly see today, that organizations adopt technologies from different cloud service providers. And the next question is, when integrating multiple cloud service providers, technologies together. How can we integrate them securely? How can we integrate this service in a secure way, right? And most of the service within a cloud service providers can integrate very well together, and they are also cloud native service to help you oversee or watch your service. However, when one service provider and another service is from another one, you need to find a way to integrate not only the service, but also the security monitoring system, how you can monitor all of them together.
Well, both of those sound like really exciting research projects. So thanks to each of you for just the contributions that you've had to the community. Obviously, most of the world is moving to public cloud. So the findings that you guys have had both here in this most recent edition of the Cloud Threat Report, as well as your ongoing research, I personally think has had a really big impact on just raising awareness from a global perspective around some of the challenges that organizations are having when it comes to securing public clouds like AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. So thanks for both of your work. Thanks for keeping us apprised of the latest threats. So thanks so much for joining today. It was great having each of you on the program.
Thank you so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. To find out more, please visit us at cloudsecuritytoday.com.